It's the sound of laughter, of an old woman and an old man knocking themselves out in a tent. It starts out dry and small and ends up so uproarious and big that to preserve his dignity, even the angel has to turn his face aside. Before we ask any questions about the laughter, we should first just listen to it. It starts out with a startled catch of the breath, because the last thing either of them expected to do was to laugh, and it takes them by surprise as much as it takes us. It wells up in their throats like sorrow, only it's not sorrow, and contorts their faces like tears, only that's not what it is either, or at least it's a different kind of tears. Their shoulders shake, their faces go red, their china teeth slip a notch. She will be 91 on her next birthday, and the angel says she will celebrate it in the maternity ward. Sarah stuffs her apron in her mouth. Abraham gasps for air. And then the question, where does their laughter come from? I think it comes from as deep a place as tears come from, and in a way it comes from the same place. As much as tears do, it comes out of the darkness of the world, where God is of all missing persons the most missed, except that it comes not as an ally of darkness, but as the adversary of darkness, not as a symptom of darkness, but as the antidote to darkness. The laughter of Abraham and Sarah at the angel's extraordinary announcement does not eliminate the darkness, because through the long childless years of the past, darkness has already taken its toll on those two old people. And in the long years that lie ahead, there will be darkness for them still, as for instance when Abraham is asked to take the child of the promise and offer him to God as a burnt offering. They both still have to face the darkness, both of death and of life, in a world where God is seen at best only from afar, through a glass darkly. But with their laughter, something new breaks into their darkness, something so unexpected and preposterous and glad that they can only laugh at it in astonishment. To weep at tragedy, the way Jesus did, is to weep at that which is inevitable. Given the vulnerability of human beings and the pitiless storm of the world, tragedy is bound to happen to every one of us. Given the sinfulness of humans and the temptation of the world to sin, tragedy is bound to happen. Man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward, Job says, and there is an inevitability to the tears we shed over it. They're part of what it means to be human, but the announcement of the angel is just the reverse of that. They're going to have a baby, after all. It's just what was bound not to happen. The old man is going to be the father of a great nation in spite of everything. It's just what was not inevitable. If anything was inevitable, it was that the soup would be spilled on him again. The stranger who appeared at their tent door turned out to be not a man to read the meter, but an angel. Who could have possibly predicted it? Who could have possibly made it happen? Grabbed an angel by the wing and pulled him down out of the sky and contrived for him to give such astonishing news. It all happened not of necessity, not inevitably, but gratuitously, freely, hilariously. And what was astonishing, gratuitous, hilarious, was, of course, the grace of God. What could they do but laugh at the preposterousness of it? And they laughed until the tears ran down their cheeks. The tragic is the inevitable. The comic is the unforeseeable. How can Donald Duck foresee that after being run over by a steamroller, he will pick himself up on the other side as flat as a pancake for a few seconds, but alive and squawking? How can Charlie Chaplin in his baggy pants and derby hat foresee that though he has stood up by the girl and clobbered over the head with the policeman and hit in the kisser with a custard pie, he will emerge dapper and gallant to the end, twirling his invincible cane and twitching his invincible mustache? Bored to death by his comforters and scratching his boils and facing the undertaker's unpaid bill for the multiple funeral of his children and entire household staff, how could Job possibly foresee that his bloodshot eyes would indeed behold, and by no means as a stranger, the one who laid the foundation of the earth, and at whose work the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Who could have predicted that God himself would choose not Esau, the honest and reliable, but Jacob, the trickster and heel? That he would put the finger on Noah, who hit the bottle, or on Moses, who was trying to beat the rap in Midian for braining a man in Egypt, and said if it weren't for the honor of the thing, he'd just as soon let Aaron go back and face the music? Or on the prophets, who were a ragged lot, mad as hatters, most of them, and dragging their feet to a man when they were called to hit the sawdust trail? Who could have foretold that out of the sordid affair between David and Uriah's wife Bathsheba, Solomon would be born with his high IQ and his passion for ecclesiastical architecture, and that out of Solomon would be born a whole line of apostate kings, ending finally in a king, the likes of whom nobody could possibly have foretold, except maybe second Isaiah, who saw at least that it wasn't his beaux yeux that would draw men to him, or by the power of his heavy artillery that he would king it over them. Jesus says, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden." That's the tragedy. Our laboring couldn't have been otherwise, given who we are and who we're not, given who God is and who he is not, given this world and all its beauty and pain to live in and die in. Then he says, "And I will give you rest." That is the comedy. And the comedy has to do with both Jesus as a speaker and the gospel word he speaks. And he speaks in parables, and the parables can be read as a kind of comedy, dark comedy. God is the comic shepherd who gets more of a kick out of that one lost sheep once he finds it again than out of the 99 who had the good sense not to get lost in the first place. God is the eccentric host who, when the country cloud all turns out to have other things more important to do than come live it up with him, goes out into the skid rows and soup kitchens and charity wards of Cedar Rapids or wherever it is and brings home a freak show. The man with no legs who sells shoelaces at the corner, the old woman in the moth-eaten fur coat who makes her daily rounds of the garbage cans, the old wino with his pint in the brown paper bag, the pusher, the whore, the village idiot who stands at the blinker light waving his hand as the cars go by. They are seated at the damask blade table in the great hall. The candles are all lit and the champagne glasses filled. At a sign from the host, the musicians in their gallery strike up Amazing Grace. If you have to explain it, don't bother. I think these parables could be read as jokes about God, in the sense that they're essentially about the outlandishness of God, who does impossible things with impossible people. And I believe that the comedy of them is not just a device, a preacher's device for making the truth that they contain go down easy, but that the truth that they contain can itself be thought of as comic, a comic truth. And it's hard to think of any place where that's more apparent than the greatest parable of them all, the great parable. The prodigal son goes off with his inheritance and blows the whole pile on liquor and sex and fancy clothes until finally he doesn't have 2 cents left to rub together and has to go to work or starve to death. He gets a job in a pig farm and keeps it long enough to observe the pigs are getting a better deal than he is, and then decides to go home. There's nothing edifying about that decision. There's no indication that he realizes he's made an ass of himself and broken his old man's heart. There's no indication that he thinks of his old man as anything more than a meal ticket. There's no sign that he's sorry for what he's done, or that he's resolved to make amends somehow and do better next time. He decides to go home for the simple reason that he knows he always got 3 squares a day at home. And for a man who was in danger of starving to death, that's reason enough. So he sets out on the return trip, and on the way rehearses the speech he hopes will soften the old man's heart, enough so that at least he won't slam the door in his face. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. That will hit him where he lives, if anything will, the boy thinks. And he goes over it again. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, trying to get the inflection right and the gestures right. And just about the time he thinks he has it down, the old man spots him coming around the corner below the tennis court and starts sprinting down the drive like a maniac. Before the boy has time to get so much as the first word out, the old man throws his arms around him and all but knocks him off his feet with the tears and whiskers and incredulous laughter of his welcome. The boy is back. That's all that matters. Who cares why he's back? And the old man doesn't do what any other father under heaven would have been inclined to do. He doesn't say he hopes he's learned his lesson, or I told you so. He doesn't say he hopes he's finally ready to settle down for a while and will find some way to make it up to his mother. He just says, bring him something to eat, for God's sake. Bring him some warm clothes to put on. And when the boy finally manages to slip his prepared remarks in edgewise, the old man doesn't even hear them. He's in such a state. All he can say is the boy was dead and is alive again. The boy was lost, is found again. And then at the end of the scene, what Jesus, as teller of the parable, says is, they began to make merry of all things. They turn on the stereo. They break out the best liquor. They roll back the living room carpet. They ring up the neighbors. I wonder if it's possible to say that it's only when you hear the gospel as a wild and marvelous joke that you really hear it. Heard as anything else, the gospel is the church's thing. It's the preacher's thing, the lecturer's thing. Heard as a joke, high and unbidden and ringing with laughter, it can only be God's thing. And if it's a joke about the preposterousness of God, it's also a joke about the preposterousness of man, as the sequel to the parable exemplifies. The word sin is somehow too grand a word to apply to the reaction of the prodigal's elder brother when the sound of the hoedown reaches him out in the pasture among the cow flocks. And yet, in another way, sin is just the right word, because nowhere is the deadliness of all 7 of the deadly sins deadlier or more ludicrous than it is in him. Envy and pride and anger and covetousness, they're all there. Even sloth is there as he sits on his patrimony and lets it gain interest for him without lifting a hand. Even lust, as he slavers over the harlots whom he points out the prodigal has squandered his cash on. The older brother is Pecksniff. He is Tartuffe. He's what Mark Twain called a good man in the worst sense of the word. He is a caricature of all that is joyless and petty and self-serving about all of us. The joke of it is that, of course, his father loves him, even so, and has always loved him, and will always love him. Only the older brother never noticed it because it was never love he was bucking for, but only his due. The fatted calf, the best liquor, the hoedown, could all have been his, too, any time he asked for them, except that he never thought to ask for them because he was too busy trying cheerlessly and religiously to earn them. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, even as the prodigal himself was raised up, Jesus says, and blessed is he who takes no offense at me. Blessed is he who is not offended, that no man receives what he deserves, but vastly more. Blessed is he who gets that joke, who sees that miracle. The ones who don't see it, Jesus says,